Good morning and welcome to the American Enterprise Institute, both those of you in the room and those watching online. We're delighted to have you with us this morning for our conversation revolving around blurring the line, politics and the military in a post-9/11 America. My name is Rebecca Burgess. I'm a research fellow in Veterans Studies and American Institutions here, which means I think about civil society and the military both with and without the dash in that civil-military relations. I'm joined by my AEI colleagues Giselle Donnelly and Carlin Bowman, and a posse of fine brains who will make you forget that you didn't have enough coffee this morning because of their riveting conversation about this immensely and of-the-moment topic. Our event this morning will be structured in two panels, the first led off by former Marine Corps infantry officer and former legislative director and foreign policy advisor for U.S. Senator Tom Cotton, Joe Crystal, in a discussion about veterans and their second service in politics. After an in-panel discussion moderated by Joe, he will open up the floor for a question and answer session with the audience. We'll end at 8:55, and if you could please stay in your seats for our staff to do their movie magic up here, that would be wonderful. And Giselle Donnelly will then lead off the second panel, taking up the larger conversation about whether and how nearly 20 years of war have stressed or misshaped or even broken the delicate balance required of our particular constitution-driven civil-military relationship. The second panel will follow the format of the first and end with a question and answer session. A small logistics note about that, please wait for one of our staff with a microphone to come to you if you have a question. State your name and affiliation, and please, as always, ask your question in the form of a question. Despite their diminishing trust overall in key American political and social institutions, Americans continue to voice overwhelming trust in the U.S. military. This seems to have influenced politicians, advocacy groups, voters, and the media increasingly to turn to current and former members of the military to engage in policy debates in the public forum, to accept leadership positions within government, and even to save Congress by running for Congress. This despite a revered tradition of maintaining distance between a supposedly apolitical military and political goings-on. But can senior military leaders remain nonpartisan in their policy roles? Is an apolitical stance really apolitical in practice? In an age of heightened partisanship and polarization, is it possible to maintain nonpartisanship while engaging in public service? Please join me in welcoming Joe and our panelists as we embark on this discussion.
It's always good to do a military panel early in the morning because we'll actually show up on time, presumably. So it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you very much, Rebecca, for inviting me to moderate this panel on this interesting topic. Rebecca asked me to join as a veteran who worked on the Hill in the office of another veteran, Senator Cotton, as she mentioned. So I thought I'd just share one very quick example of what it's like when you put veterans together on the Hill. So as probably many of you know in this room, when combatant commanders or service chiefs are slated to testify before the Armed Services Committees, they often make the rounds in the personal offices to sort of prep the battlefield, so to speak, for the Q&A to follow. And so whenever they would come to our office and I would staff those meetings, they'd sort of be a little bit uptight sometimes. And to break the ice, Senator Cotton would look at me and say, "You met Joe, he's a Marine, he's the first Marine I ever hired, biggest mistake I ever made. We're still teaching him how to read." And the service chiefs and combatant commanders would sort of laugh nervously. If they laughed too hard, I was always a little bit suspicious of them, but recommend, don't confirm this guy. But it was a great experience for me, and my sort of reward back to Senator Cotton when I left is I made sure to recruit another Marine to replace me so that he didn't have to change his sort of shtick after I left. One quick stat, which I thought I'd share, and I know we'll get a lot more interesting stats. So in this Congress, there's 96 vets. It's about 18% of Congress, down from 74% in the early 1970s. So it's been a steady decline, really from the 70s to the early 2000s. And since 2003, the number of vets in Congress has hovered around 20%, give or take. One interesting thing is that Marines are punching above their weight. I believe there's 17 Marines in Congress. If you just went by the number of Marines by manpower, which is maybe not the best comparison, real political science would say, well, we should look at the Marine veterans relative to all the veterans, but just looking at actual people on active duty and in the reserves, there should be about 10 Marines in Congress. So Marines are punching above their weight in one sense, that there's 17, not 10. On the other hand, the only indicted member of Congress is also a Marine, so we have to own that, unfortunately. Anyway, so we have a distinguished group of experts here to my left. Let me introduce them quickly. Jeremy Teigen, excuse me, political science professor at Ramapo College, author of a book, Why Veterans Run, Military Service in American Presidential Elections from 1789 to 2016. As Rebecca told me, when Seth, to Jeremy's left, was looking for data when Seth started Veterans Campaign, he found that Jeremy was one of the only people studying this and actually able to sort of supply this data and publishing on it. And Rebecca, I think, had the same experience. Seth is a former Marine amphibious assault vehicle officer. So we have two Marines on this panel, a little bit dangerous. He's deployed a couple times. When he left active duty, he went to the Woodrow Wilson School where he got his master's and also founded the Veterans Campaign, which is a nonpartisan organization that offers candidate training workshops for veterans. And Seth is still serving as a lieutenant colonel in the Marine Reserves. Next, we have Carlin Bowman, who's a senior fellow at AEI and an expert on public opinion and polling data on a variety of subjects. She writes for Forbes, and I just saw a very inspiring blog post, I think, that you put up on AEI about Election Day, which obviously was earlier this week. When Americans go to the polls next year, in 2020, it'll be the 59th time and an unbroken line since 1789 that Americans will cast their votes freely, a record that can't be found anywhere else in the world. So I thought that was a lovely reminder that we shouldn't take this for granted. We look forward to hearing your thoughts on public opinion today. And then finally, Rebecca, who's a research fellow here and obviously focuses on this. I don't need to introduce you. So with that, I think, Jeremy, I'm going to turn it over to you for a few opening remarks, and we'll go down the line, and then we'll dive into some questions.
Sure. I want to first thank Rebecca for inviting me to this. It's great to be here and be a part of this. I want to start with just taking one of those sort of quantitative trend lines that you mentioned and add my perspective in that you spoke to the decline of the number of people in this town here in Washington that have military experience, and that's certainly quantitatively true, but I want to make sure that we see it in the context of that military veterans are still numerically grossly overrepresented in American politics. The proportion of people in Congress is clearly lower than it was back in the 70s when 3/4 of the Congress had military service. But that's a product of the fact that was the World War II generation when we needed 3/4 of the guys that were born between 1915 and 1925 to win World War II. And we stopped requiring such large land armies and need a smaller military. And so we're making fewer veterans. But the way I perceive electoral politics, by seeing two of the individuals who were running for the Democratic nomination in this cycle coming to the table with military service, for people that age, that's another overrepresentation quantitatively of the attraction of that American electoral the milieu of American electoral experience seems to attract those with military experience, and I believe it's both a pull and a push. I think American political parties go out of their way to recruit, and I think that those with military experience are individually motivated. So, I acknowledge the aggregate decline, of course, but I want to put it in the context that roughly 10% of our electorate have military service, but far more than that in American politics have military experience.
That's a good reminder. I mean, Seth, you're doing work now to, even despite that fact, to try to reverse the decline. So tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, I think Jeremy says is obviously correct. There's been a bit of a decline. There seems to be some sort of an idea of as a proportion of the expected population that there is also a decline. Like you'd expect a certain number, and it used to be there was what you might call a veteran bonus. Sort of have. If you looked at the population of who was serving in Congress, you'd see a larger proportion of veterans and larger than their proportion of the overall population, and that seems to be with the Vietnam generation was not the case. And as we're seeing the post-9/11 generation begin to take their role, you're seeing them, like you're sort of saying, punching above their weight. We're seeing that in the presidential election. I think is a good example. You have people who, it seems to be tough for veterans to get their foot in the door, but once they do, they seem to move up pretty quickly. And look at the presidential race for a while until Joe Sestak got into the race, which he hasn't really made a huge splash yet, but it was of the four youngest, all except for Swalwell had been in the military, and then the oldest, which was Mike Gravel, had been in the military before Vietnam. So you sort of had this kind of bracketed that generation, which I think is a big part of why the decline happened. For a lot of reasons why you sort of see the Vietnam generation not wanting to get as involved, both because of, I think, who came into the military at that time and sort of how they felt about politics coming out of the military. 9/11 generation seems to be a lot more interested in getting involved. And that's what we're seeing. But we're seeing some other interesting things as well, which is, for example, that sort of the beginning of the first women veterans coming in to politics, and looks like they're punching way above their weight class. It seems like, I think I did a study a couple years ago, real back of the envelope math, but it looked like if you'd, for young women in Congress, they're like 17 times more likely to serve the military than just young women overall. And there are a bunch of reasons for that. I mean, I think it's sort of hard to kind of, unless you're from a family that does this kind of thing, or you have some, special thing going on, it's hard to kind of set yourself apart at that young age that people will take you seriously in military service because of the respect that the public holds to the military is one of those things that gives you some credibility. And I think the other new group I've been interested in looking at is military spouses, which you wouldn't always think about as first as the people who'd be getting involved, but in our program now, and we're the University of San Francisco, we have a master's program now that some of our best students are some of the military spouses. I kind of look at it sort of the Top Gun. You look at who Maverick was dating versus who Goose is married to, sort of the old school, the new school, and sort of at a certain point, maybe 20 years ago, a bunch of us sort of in the military began marrying folks outside the military who were also, in a way, punching above our weight class. So that's sort of another interesting part. I'll leave it at that.
I appreciate those comments. Carlin, keep us honest on how public opinion is actually.
Well, I'll try to do that. I'm AI's sort of dilettante of data. I skate over public opinion on a wide variety of subjects, and I've been mostly preoccupied with impeachment in the 2020 election, so this is a nice change for me. I thought I'd begin by comparing attitudes toward two institutions to talk about one of the reasons I think the military is so successful in the public mind. And the Gallup organization and several other pollsters got into the business of surveying our confidence in institutions in the early 1970s. And Gallup, whom we trust on so many things in this area, started asking questions about confidence in the military in the early 70s, and they also asked confidence in Congress at that time. And just to give you the numbers, in 1975, 58% had a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in the military. That's now 73%, impressive change. Compare that to Congress. In 1973, 42% had high confidence in Congress. That's now 11% today. So going in exactly the opposite direction. 45% of Americans and roughly 8 in 10 in the military would recommend a military career to a young person. If you ask that question about Congress, a question that's been asked since 1943 by Gallup, when they asked whether or not you would recommend that a son go into the military, they've changed that to a son or daughter. As you might expect, that number is about 22%. So again, you get a sense of the esteem, consistent esteem that people have held the military in. How does the public come to these judgments about the military and Congress? I think there are a number of reasons that you can see by looking at the data. Certainly a lot of them are performance measures. And you see public opinion change on core institutions, go up and down as it's done both on Congress and the military. But if you look at specific agencies, they're able to recover from a very bad period based on performance usually. FEMA after Katrina, NASA after the Space Shuttle Challenger, all of them have recovered confidence. And even the VA, in such ill repute a few years ago, has gone up about 10 percentage points in the Gallup data overall. I think proximity clearly helps. All of us know someone, or at least more of us, quite a few of us know someone who served in the military, even if it's not the direct connection it once was. I think another thing is very important, and that is that the military's mission is very clearly and narrowly defined in the public's mind. Congress has myriad responsibilities. There's just a lot to criticize, and the public is very critical these days overall. I remember many years ago being struck by a single public opinion poll finding when one of the drug czars suggested that the military be involved in drug interdiction. A pollster was in the field and asked the question, is this a good idea? The public balked completely at the idea, even though drug interdiction is something we'd like to do something about. They didn't see it as the military's mission. They wanted to keep the military to that clearly defined mission, and I think that's a reason that it's been so successful. Also, in the post-volunteer military era, I know Americans see, and you see this in the polls that aren't questions that aren't asked very often, that serving in the military is an act of patriotism and it's an act of sacrifice. And I think many Americans, though there are some conflicting data on this, still see the military as an avenue of upward mobility. And so I think all of those things affect confidence in institutions. This year, AP and the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago asked people about whether or not they'd be excited or it wouldn't make much difference to them, or whether they wouldn't be very excited if a number of different kinds of candidates ran for the presidency. And in that particular battery of questions, they asked about 14 different groups, and the top response was someone who had prior government service, and following that very, very closely was service in the military. So again, it's seen as something very, very positive. Few pollsters survey veterans. You're considered a rare group in our business. Again, even though you're a large group, it's expensive to survey military. We know the military itself does a lot of survey work that's usually proprietary overall. So we don't have a lot of data on attitudes of people in the military. The Pew polls, which are truly exceptional and have been done about the post-9/11 veterans and compared them to earlier cohorts, but those are really recall data, asking people to think back to their experience. They're not the kind of questions that I think are more reliable in some surveys overall. But Pew is providing, I think, a very, very rich portrait, and you should look at the work that they've done, I think, and released in July and August. Joe asked if there was any evidence of confidence eroding in the military, and I don't see any of it in particular at this point. There have been different points where you do see it immediately after the end of the Iraq War, when that war seemed very long to many American people, but it didn't really change views about the military. Nor does scandal affect views of the military. If you go all the way back to Tailhook and take all of the scandals going all the way through Abu Ghraib, do not affect the military. And that's a very unusual thing in the American political environment overall. Scandals stick to Congress like glue. And so you get these two very different institutions, success largely based, I think, on performance. And again, there's no evidence, I think, of confidence eroding at this particular point. I think most of us are so grateful that people are serving when we're not. And I think the larger question, of course, is what Americans want America's role in the world to be. And that's a very big question that will be debated by members of Congress and others. And so I'll stop there.
Appreciate those comments. One thing we were talking about before the panel was there seems to be a kind of a prevalence of articles often written about, a couple of veterans who fought in Iraq or Afghanistan, and they have a view of a certain, strategy going forward. And it's rarely based, it seems, on actual kind of empirical polling data. It's often based on a couple interesting anecdotes. And so, hopefully someone in this room or on this panel can help to go out and solve that. It would be interesting, I think, to see how veterans, view the wars they fought in and the sort of plan going forward. Yeah. I think the panel after us will get into the civil military dimensions of that question and the damage that might do or not do.
But one of the interesting things about that is the polling business has changed in the last 50 years as I watched it. The kinds of questions that are being asked about military service today, about whether the military has been helpful enough in the transition to civilian life, those questions never would have been asked after World War II. We're much more emotional in the way that we approach issues, and that's affecting the kinds of questions that we're seeing and perhaps the impressions of a more negative view of some particular veterans. But I don't see the evidence of it more broadly.
Finally, Rebecca.
Well, it's hard to follow up Carlin with anything interesting. I just want to ask for more questions. But actually, something that you said really piqued my interest, which is if in the 80s, the public did not want the military to change roles, or not necessarily change roles, but to also be involved in the drug fights. That's fascinating because not that many years before, both Kennedy and Truman basically talked about trying to change or broaden the scope of what the military does. And I'm thinking of the third face of the war speech and things like that about Vietnam. So that's very interesting to try and figure out what's going on there. So I wanted to talk a little bit about just very kind of hard numbers of where post-9/11 veterans and other veterans are in politics right now, but also to ask the other question, or to raise the other issue of there's both veterans in politics and there's the question of veterans and politics, which is the public thinks when post-9/11 veterans are running for office now that one of their biggest interests is in helping their fellow veterans through policy. And it turns out most post-9/11 veterans aren't super interested in sitting on SVAC or HVAC, the committees dealing with Veterans Affairs. They might talk about it when they're running for office, but they actually don't show up on those committees. Not that you get to choose your committees necessarily, but you can influence sometimes where you end up. And most post-9/11 veterans actually don't know who their fellow veterans are in Congress, which has been a really fascinating thing for me to discover as I've had offices ask me who the veterans are in Congress. And I thought, oh, well, let me tell you who your fellows are. So right now, over the past few elections, one of the most interesting and one of the favorite stories has been about veterans running for office, especially post-9/11 veterans, and especially about female veterans running for office. And part of that is part of a longer trend that if you look at state-level legislatures, you see more women running for elected office, more female veterans, and they tend to run as Democrats rather than Republicans. And there's always kind of a big question mark about that, but it makes sense if you think about the context of the 1980s, which was, 1980 was the first year when the academies graduated females, when the military academies graduated females. So the type of woman was probably not your standard issue card-carrying Republican who would have been interested and wanting to be among those first groups of women, really breaking down kind of traditional constructs of how we think about women and their role in the world. So it's no wonder that they are running more on the Democrat side than the Republican side, I think. And it's also, right now, we just, thanks to some of my wonderful interns who do a lot of terrible digging in the research vineyards for me, we've been going through the state level legislatures since 2018, so trying to understand what has the change been since 2016, the last time we did this. And actually, the numbers of veterans in state legislatures have gone down. They're about 12% right now. They were about 14% on average. But the number of women veterans has risen. They're about 38. No, they're about 50-something now, and there used to be about 38. So that's an interesting trend because of these two things. The traditional path towards elected office in America Congress has usually started at the state and local level. And when we look at the veterans who are in the state legislatures right now, if they're in the Senate, they have had prior experience in the House. If they're in the House, they usually have been a county commissioner. And so you can see that they're following traditional political paths of gaining experience. It's really unrealistic to think of someone who has been serving overseas or perhaps even for 20 years in the military coming back to a hometown and suddenly being elected to office because they don't have ties to their local issues or even their local fundraisers. And it's expensive to run for office, and you need time and name recognition to build up those donor networks. That's just a reality of present politics. So overall, of course, veterans do run, I think, 2-to-1, Republican versus Democrat, and that holds vaguely similar in the U.S. Senate and U.S. Congress. And once again, it's been interesting to look at how veterans talk about why they are running for Congress. I did a very large study in 2016 that's still ongoing because there are thousands of pages of the public rhetoric of veterans as they run for Congress. Do they run against Congress? Do they run to fix Congress? Do they run against the politician who was in that place before them? And it's kind of mixed. A lot of it is actually, and maybe Seth can pick up on this question of we think that there is something wrong or broken or threatened in our sense of civic life and civil society, and we want to address that as opposed to really strong policy-based issues. And I think that's an interesting moment that does explain why the American public tends to think of veterans running for office as very patriotic and a good fit for what their needs are, even while veterans themselves don't always necessarily seem to understand you have to run as a Republican or a Democrat to get elected, that there are these two political parties, that there are these political constructs that you have to be aware of to be a politician.
And I think there's also a lot of the folks we talk to, train, immediately want to run for federal office. And part of it's just because I don't think they really understand what state and local office holders do. Like a lot of people don't, right? But if you're a teacher and you're getting into politics, you understand what the school board does. You understand what state level the effect it can have. If you've been serving the military for a bunch of years, often you haven't really been, in a community for all that long and gotten roots there. And you've sort of seen what the federal government does, and that's sort of kind of where your head is at. I think that's one of the other challenges there is you're seeing a lot of folks we talk to say immediately wanting to run for Congress or even the Senate, and we often will say, look, it's sort of like being for the Navy guys, be a captain of a ship, right? Like you could be the smartest guy in the world, you're Steve Jobs, you're Mark Zuckerberg, you probably still couldn't immediately be the captain of the ship. You might be able to, be one level up and, be the best division officer, you'd be a department head, but you probably can't be the captain of the ship without some experience. And that's, being in Congress is sort of that level. Some people do it, but it's a lot harder, I think, one, to get elected, and two, to actually, really have a sense of what you're doing when you get there.
I think one thing as I was sort of polling a few of my friends who are veterans about, what would be the barriers for you, friend, to go and run for office? You could make the argument that, it's hard for anybody to run for federal office, and it's kind of daunting. You have to have a lot of connections, wealth, and so on. There are a couple of things that I think are truly unique that affect veterans, though. And I'm sure you all have experienced different versions of this. One that came to mind was that veterans are rarely independently wealthy, unfortunately. Number two, they've been in a politics-free zone for most of their career. So just even learning how to engage in the debate and not just be the nonpartisan, above it all, above the fray, sort of military leader can be challenging. And then a third very practical one, which hadn't occurred to me, is that when you're assigned these different duty stations, you literally don't have a track record of living in your community. And I think there was sort of a sharp exchange in the 2018 race. I can't remember which campaign it was, between a candidate who accused the veteran of being a carpetbagger, and that the response was something along the lines of, sorry, I couldn't put my roots down here while I was surveying abroad and these different military bases. So those arguments can be defanged. But I'm curious, what are the different challenges that you all hear, and maybe particularly you, Seth, and that you try to go and sort of resolve when you find interesting veterans who can potentially run for office?
Yeah, I'll say first of all, that wasn't one race; it's many races,
including John McCain's.
Including John McCain's, sort of the first famous one, where he said, famously said, I would have loved to grow up in Scottsdale, but I was in a military family. The longest I lived in one place was in Hanoi, and that was a fairly effective response. Amy McGrath had a similar situation with, I think it might be what you're referring to, a couple of years ago with her primary opponent, and it was interesting because they ran an ad on TV but never on the internet, and the only reason it ever got out was because someone took a cell phone video of this ad. Not really. It was actually try to be very respectful. We respect her military service, but shouldn't she live somewhere near us for a few years before she gets involved? And the response was just pretty damning. I always say to people who we train, pray that somebody publicly condemns you for this. Now, voters may, on their own, just say, well, this isn't someone who's I really know, and I think there are still going to be barriers to entry because of being away. But if someone explicitly attacks you for this, it was I think Ted Lieu, posted this on Twitter, and then Chelsea Handler got a hold of it and retweeted it to her 10 gazillion followers, and it just I'm sure money was just pouring in. And Amy went on and won the race a couple days later by pretty handily. There are a lot of say barriers to entry for veterans. I think a lot of them are just, you mentioned a lot of them already. I think a big one today, and Rebecca touched on this a little bit, is fundraising. One is, if you've been a lawyer or an executive in your district for 20 years, you'll have a bit of a Rolodex that you can ask for people from. If you've been in the military for a long time and haven't been back in your district, you don't know. First of all, you don't have a lot of people who have a ton of money, but you also don't know local people who have a ton of money. The other part of it is, I think almost a bigger part, is that a lot of people coming out of the military are just not conditioned to ask people to donate. Like it's just a really tough thing for people. It's just not something you've really done, and it almost kind of goes against your sort of general ethos, I think, to ask, kind of asking for help. That's one big part of it. There are other things where just the general idea of military service. Since 9/11, I think more and more people have gotten accustomed to knowing somebody who's been in the military. But even so, I think it's kind of funny. As the confidence in the military has gone up for the population, the sort of familiarity with the military has also gone down. And I try not to think those things are necessarily related, but maybe partially so. There's a huge amount of respect for the military, but people don't really understand what people in the military do, right? So what have you actually done for the last 20 years, and how does that actually prepare you to be in office?
It's
Those
sort
are
of
the big things.
It reminds me of, there's often a challenge in the private sector of understanding what veterans do too, and veterans are not necessarily the best at writing resumes because they don't like to say "I" a lot, and maybe they talk about killing the enemy too much, and there's some coaching required, which applies to politics as well. One question I have is, leaving aside whether there should be more veterans in Congress, and we can come back to that, I'm curious, once they get there, I think the argument that often is made is, well, veterans can reach across the aisle, they can be bipartisan, this with honor pack, which some of you are probably familiar with. They, I think, coined the term cross-partisan. And I'm curious, Jeremy, and really anyone else who has experience with this, is there really evidence that veterans are, in fact, cross-partisan, bipartisan, reaching across the aisle once they get elected?
In the 2018 midterms, my phone was ringing off the hook with reporters wanting to talk about the surge of military veterans running for office, and especially, we mentioned a couple times, women with military experience running for office. It was quite salient, and I want to assure you, normally my phone does not ring for any circumstances whatsoever. And at the tail end of virtually every question of every reporter's expectations was this either implied or explicit question that, well, surely these people can come fix Washington's polarization problem. And that's a big ask. That is a really big ask for people. Like, if anyone could, I suppose they could. But this town isn't wired for that. An expectation that military veterans could, come to Washington D.C. and resist the pressures that have, built up since McGovern, Frazier, and the forces that have turned this town into a hyper-polarized town where members of Congress don't even speak to members of the other party. It's a challenge that it would be difficult to ask anyone to achieve. But I suppose if there are signs that it could happen, I can hope. I can hope, but it would be very difficult.
Rebecca, have you seen different?
Well, I was going to say, I want to chime in here. So I think actually now is the moment where we can start seeing whether this beautiful narrative is true, because right now we're approaching critical mass, I think is the proper terminology, right, Crew? About 18-20% of an organization, when they have that type of an identity, they can actually be thought of as influencing or have the capacity of influencing an institution. And so we haven't really seen, once again, as I mentioned, veterans don't seem to know who their fellow veterans are. That's a very large clue that this narrative is weaker than the popular representation of it is. But the second is that Congress itself has changed so much since the 70s, when there were so many veterans, the height of veterans in Congress. How leadership and how the committees work is an incredibly different thing. It's really party politics and party leadership that drives legislation within Congress, and not really the committee chairs. And so those from the outside who are looking at veterans as the savior to this and not understanding those internal pressures, and also that there is no such thing as Congress, it's the House and the Senate, that they're, I want to say, sometimes setting up veterans for failure in the idea of what they can accomplish, and therefore perhaps influencing the rhetoric about Congress being broken, not on purpose, but just this is how we talk about giving these outsized expectations to this group, and then expecting them to somehow work this miracle that's not possible, especially when they're political neophytes, if you will. But the other thing that I kind of wanted to push back on in terms of the barriers is the political question. And that's because obviously veterans come from both the active duty and National Guard and the reserves. And there are a fair amount of National Guard veterans or members in Congress. And as I was in a conversation the other day with leadership of the reserves, and it struck me, something I'd never thought of, is that the National Guard actually is an incredibly political power and influence. Each state legislative staffers who deal with the Guard on the Hill will tell you that when they call, they say, "How high do I jump?" But that doesn't happen for the reserves. So someone who is coming out of that kind of relationship in terms of their military experience in Congress may have a very different way of approaching politics, whether they actually enter politics or they comment on it from the side. And I think that we might want to look at a little bit more, or study a little bit more, as we're looking at so many, or maybe not so many, it seems like many, looking to military officers or former military officers to comment on current politics. So just wanted to throw that one in there.
I have one. Oh, go ahead, Carlin.
I was just going to pick up on something that Rebecca had said, because I think the narrative is a lot weaker in other areas too. When you were getting those calls about, are veterans going to make a difference, I was getting the calls of, are these women going to make a difference? And so I've been looking pretty carefully at this very large class of women, because they do have critical mass in the House right now. And at least the early evidence, and perhaps it's premature, and I think it is probably premature to make a judgment on whether they're going to make a significant difference. The evidence just isn't there at this particular point. Individual members have been phenomenally successful, like Nancy Pelosi, but to suggest that they're operating together, united, moving certain pieces of legislation forward, we just don't have the evidence of that at this point. Now, maybe they've looked at regular order on some of those kinds of things and trying to pursue a more civil atmosphere, but beyond that, I'm not sure we're seeing the evidence. And public opinion polls overwhelmingly said women are going to make a big difference in Congress, because you wanted the change to occur, but there's just not a lot of evidence yet.
I think you're not going to probably see like a sweeping change, something you would pick up in some sort of a survey, because the numbers are still very small. But at the same time, I think I can point to a lot of anecdotal evidence, which of that at least attempts to, have some kind of coming together where other folks would be less likely to, especially with those who are newer. I think as you come into this town, it's going to polarize you a little bit over time. But I think that it's obviously going to be anecdotal at this point because it's a small number. And I think if you look overall, other thing to look at is sort of the overall population. I think a big, you sort of, is the country polarized because Congress is polarized, or is the Congress polarized because the people are polarized? And I think, there might be some of both, but people in this country are generally pretty polarized about politics. And looking at the military and veterans community, I think it's one of the least polarized groups that has people from, all sides of the aisle, different political views, in it. And I would say that, that there aren't that many organizations or groups that have political yet nonpartisan yet civil get-togethers, or organizations able to do that consistently. I think that says something about at least the potential to create some improvement in the atmosphere.
So my personal hypothesis is that while there might not be, much hope for cooperation on real policy issues, I think there is some value of veterans working together to make things a bit more civil and bringing back a little bit of decency, adherence to norms. I don't think this is breaking news, but I remember, for example, Mike Gallagher, congressman from Wisconsin, a Marine vet, was at Seth Moulton's wedding, another Marine vet. One, Gallagher, pretty conservative Republican, Moulton, pretty liberal Democrat, but they both were post-9/11 vets. I think they were like workout buddies in the house gym or something. And they did cooperate a little bit on national security issues. So maybe national security is the exception to the rule on the policy side. But I do think there's a little bit of the decency, civility that, that shared experience of serving the military, and also just knowing that, for some at least, have seen combat and so on, they know that there's bigger, kind of more challenging things that they've experienced than just the kind of day-to-day fights of being on Capitol Hill. That keeps things in perspective. I want to, very quickly before we turn over to the audience, want to get into the presidential aspects. We focused on so much on Congress. We already mentioned I thought there were 3 veterans running as Democrats. I had forgotten about Sestak and yes, and so I remember Moulton, Buttigieg, Gabbard, and so it is interesting. This year is very different. Obviously, we had a bit of a drought of veterans, but I think if you look at the broader sweep, we've had more veterans as commander-in-chief than not. Jeremy, this is something I think that you wrote about in your book. Would love to hear, where things, do you think this will rebound as we do get to the point where the post-9/11 generation comes of age, or is the drought going to continue?
So in looking across the entire span of people who have run for president on a major party ticket, more than half of the candidates have had military service, which is, again, a gross numerical overrepresentation of how many people who have served in uniform across time. Between World War II and 2012, there was between World War II and Bill Clinton in 1992, there was only one candidate, Herbert Humphrey, that didn't have military service. But again, the numbers of veterans in the population should dictate that there's a decline, and that the surge of quantitatively unlikely people like these women tell me that this is not a fad. And I guess I have a confession to make, which is I've been tallying House elections for 15 years, looking at the political biographies of challengers and incumbents. And 10 years ago, I would see a female with military service, and I would just, that's an outlier. Let's just put it on the side. Let's just delete that case. I don't really know what to do with that analytically. And no longer. This number of women. I live in New Jersey, and Mikey Sherrill's candidacy in a congressional district right next door was an embodiment of something that happened in 2018 that did not happen with the attempt in 2006 that the Democrats decided to try to nominate a bunch of Democrats to unseat incumbents in 2006, and Nancy Pelosi called them the fighting Dems, and they made a big deal out of it. But they were really political props running in districts where nobody had a chance. 2018, the Democratic Party and these individuals that were seeking the nominations worked in concert and found themselves in districts that they were within striking distance of winning, scaring incumbents into retirement or taking advantage of open seats. And so I don't think that this is a fad. Numerically, it just has to decline in the aggregate compared to World War II and Korean Vietnam generation candidates. But their appeal seems sufficiently strong from the party's perspective that they're not going away.
Yeah, one thing I was struck by just looking at the last century on the presidential side, it feels like we've had a drought. George H.W. Bush's, I think, funeral brought back sort of a lot of kind of remembrance, frankly, of the real World War II service of so many presidents and the real heroic service of so many. But if you look back, there was no veteran commander-in-chief between Teddy Roosevelt and Harry Truman during World War I and World War II. And that's because, the Civil War veterans had basically died, and, maybe the military was much smaller, serving the Spanish-American War and so on. But we've had these droughts before, and we've basically recovered because of demographics, and people serve because wars happen, and we grow the size of the military and so on. So it seems like, looking forward, I think we have this sort of bubble of post-9/11 vets. I agree. I don't think it's really a fad. So
Something on that, though, just real quick. I think that you probably back me up on this. That before that previous drought, it ended because we had a huge, horrible war that we'd hoped not to have, or a couple of them actually, one after the other. And so there's a lot more vets in the population. I think this is a little bit different now in that the number of vets in the population is still going down. And the number in Congress is going down, but that decline is sort of tapering off. And it seems to be we're having a larger proportion of the freshmen and newer veteran, the younger folks in Congress have military service. So I think it might be for a little bit of a different reason if we do rebound, and I think we will.
Just before you turn it, I also on that, in your book when you talk about this, Jeremy, you make the really interesting point that there was almost an exhaustion with war veterans as presidents during that same period. And I wonder about that a lot, meaning that there's a societal, you could say perhaps reaction to war, or distancing from it. And I think that that's a really interesting thing to think through right now with the fact that we have post-9/11 vets running for president, and we've never elected a Vietnam War veteran, even though several have run, and whether that is a reflection of the fact that as a nation, we literally cannot deal with the Vietnam War still, and that generation, which has been so predominant in politics for so long, it's not something that they want to settle at that level, because by electing one, then you're having to say a certain something about how you feel about that war. I'm not sure that that's correct. It's just something I've been thinking about a lot, and just acknowledging that we probably will have a post-9/11 vet as a president at some point in the near-ish future, but we probably will never have a Vietnam War veteran as president. Anyway.
On that note, to the audience, what questions do you all have? Sure.
Joel Coopersmith from Georgetown University. Do you see any difference in veterans of an all-volunteer force versus those of conscripted force or citizen soldiers versus professional soldiers in either expectation or results?
We're all looking at Jeremy.
Yeah, for those of you listening in radio, they were all staring at me. In 1973, when we ended the draft, there's a palpable conventional wisdom that the reason people join, especially when you think about the people who run for Congress, that there must be some kind of self-selection bias for people who join the armed services, that they are, flag-waving, patriotic, individuals who are join the military for selfless, defend the nation reasons. And I like to quote Jason Dempsey, another person who's written a lot about politics in the military, is that I work with a lot of people, young people in the military, and they have a lot of passions, and politics is not one of them. We can take a quick tour and go down to a local MEP station, and I'm pretty sure we're not going to find the kind of people that we're envisioning when we think of a self-selected patriotic class that's joining our military. There's, military sociologists for a very long time have looked at the motivations for people's joining, and it is occupational and economic. It is there's just myriad reasons of why people join. The very special people that we're kind of concentrating on are different than the average, and so the same kind of people, and we kind of think of the people that were joining before the end of the draft, and we think of Vietnam as an entire conscript army, but there were still people who volunteered for those wars too, and so I don't perceive a sharp contrast for those two classes between those in that served joined after 1973 and those that served before, politically speaking.
One thing I just quickly add is, having worked in the Senate, I do think there's some degree of the generational difference between the post-9/11 veterans and the veterans in the Senate who were drafted and maybe didn't deploy overseas, or even if they did, it was to Europe. And so there's a little bit of an attitudinal change, I think, with the younger generation who are serving in Congress today. And how much they sort of are open about their military service, talking about it, reflecting on it, using that to inform policy decisions and so on.
There's also, I think a bit of a couple different subsections of the sort of pre-draft and all volunteer force. There's pre-Vietnam and post-Vietnam, or I guess during Vietnam, and then the draft ends and you have pre-9/11 and post-9/11. And I think there's some real differences between. I'm not sure you contribute to which of those changes. And what I do think is kind of interesting in this point is that there are a lot of even though there aren't that many presidential candidates right now who have military service, there's a ton of them who have kids who serve the military. Like a lot more than you might expect. That even though they didn't serve the military themselves, and people who were sort of presidential contenders who didn't serve the military, whose kids did. And so I think that in some sense tells you that there's a greater respect for military service in general, just among, would you send your kids there? And two, the types of people who, during Vietnam might have in previous conflicts volunteered to go, and then might also be the type of folks who ended up running for office one day, weren't actually volunteering at the time because of a whole bunch of different reasons that I won't get into.
Yeah, I think Pence and Kane both had sons in the Marines, right?
To that point, Mitt Romney has frequently been criticized for having his sons never having served, both in 2012 and subsequently.
Sir?
Good morning. My name is Daniel Gagliano. I'm a graduate student at Johns Hopkins SAIS. What do you think the role of flag officers or retired officers who go up during a presidential candidate's candidacy speech during electoral politics should be? Do you think they should come out for people? Do you think they should encourage people to vote? And then during the primary season, do you think they should participate in those kinds of politics as well?
I think anybody can share their opinions here, and this is a good question for the next panel too.
For sure.
I'm personally fine with it. I think there's a lot of good, thoughtful consideration of these dynamics. But if we're erring on one side or the other, my perception is that we're erring too much on the side of caution, and admirals and generals are being too cautious in speaking their minds and entering the arena. And if to the point about how many former members of the military have run for president in the last, the numbers still are overrepresentative. How many former generals and admirals have run recently? I mean, General Wesley Clark. Is there any other in recent?
Joe Sestak right now.
Joe Sestak, excuse me. I don't mean to keep slandering Joe Sestak, forgetting about Joe Sestak, but there are not many others. And so there's one aspect that's literally running for office, which it's sort of striking that there haven't been, and there's obviously been a lot of very noteworthy generals in the last 30 years who could run. But that's my own personal take.
There are a few others you might not even realize are former or are generals and admirals. I mean, there's Joe Heck, formerly in Congress from Nevada. There's Scott Perry from Pennsylvania. General Jack Bergman from Michigan are some recent examples. And people don't always even realize that's the case. I think a lot of times there's an issue with if being a flag officer, going from there to Congress might feel like not just a step down, but like a big step down as far as what kind of influence you have. I personally take the view that if you've served your country and you're no longer on active duty, you have every right to express your opinion. I think right now there are enough endorsing different sides of the aisle that it doesn't cause the perception that the military is one way or the other in general, and it's kind of almost good to see that generals do have very different opinions on partisan politics. If it got to the point where all the former generals and admirals were endorsing one side or the other, that I think would be a much bigger problem, but it doesn't seem to be that way right now.
I was going to say, I feel as though this is the question of the day, actually. What role should they play, and should they be vocal, and should they be public about it? And I'll let the second panel deal with all the hard parts of that. But I kind of want to be contrary about it, because actually if you look at American history and American political history, there have been times when generals have been intensely political, as in campaigning for presidential office in their uniform. And not giving up their commission just in case, they didn't win. And so that's one example. And then, of course, around the turn of the century, you have a group of officers' wives being censured because they dared to vote, and they're officers' wives, and how dare they, because it might show something. I think overall, maybe it might be healthier for our current status of politics if more were political active, as you were saying, just voicing a political opinion, not as being sacrosanct, but just as being, well, this is my opinion. It has nothing to do with the military official opinion. But the danger with that, as I know many here will immediately say, is that because of the gap and perception and understanding of what the military is, people will take that as an official military stance, and then there were, so.
I'm very uncomfortable with it for a couple reasons. One is there's a thoughtful intellectual 4-star making an argument is one thing, but for just an average American watching the television news, when you go to the convention or look at any rally, military veterans are frequently just placed as political props in the background with their VFW hats and American Legion hats, et cetera. And the potential for just making the military a token, visual display of patriotism is I think it sullies the the dignity of the armed forces, simply. The partisan angle is also the asymmetry of the number of times that retired generals and admirals appear on Fox News probably outnumbers when it does on MSNBC, and so the potential for the partisan asymmetry also makes me uncomfortable. Now, I'm not questioning the right, though. I just I would prefer that they take the William Tecumseh Sherman line and stay out of it.
Carlin.
I share that view, in part because I think actors who are perceived as contributing to the deep partisan polarization, it just hurts the country, I think.
So I think it's a perfect segue into the next panel, and we're exactly on time. So thank you all for the great questions. Thank you, panel, for the great discussion ahead of Veterans Day and the even more important Marine Corps birthday coming up this Sunday on the final Marine line. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll go for the next panel.
Celebrating our 100th anniversary of Army ROTC at Princeton. So I'd love to talk to you about that afterwards, because I know we have a good contingent of people that we have fund.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Yes, I'm just on.
Okie dokie. Are we, all right, we're cooking with gas. Welcome to the second panel. I'm Giselle Donnelly. The first panel has certainly given us plenty to talk about. And I think it's our job just to expand the aperture and to bloviate at will. Joining me today are Nora Ben-Sahel, whose principal job these days is just down the street at Johns Hopkins. Nora, you have a new book coming out. Would you like to plug that?
Yes, next summer, a book called Adaptation Under Fire, How Militaries Change in Wartime.
Okay, very good. Buy 7 for you as a good Christmas present. Next, Jim Golby. Jim has taught at West Point, has worked in the White House. He's currently stationed at NATO, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, very good. And he is a distinguished scholar of the civil-military relations. As is Heidi. Heidi, are you still in command?
I am.
Yeah, okay.
I am.
Heidi commands the largest military intelligence brigade. She's probably reading our emails even before the Chinese do.
Absolutely not.
All right. I'm going to give very little guidance, or at least pretend to give very little guidance. But I think a good place to start would be with the final subject, and that is the intervention, particularly of very senior and very well-known flag officers and political affairs. And it seems to me that, say, the comments made recently by Admiral McRaven or General McChrystal really do cross what would be a traditional line of civil military no-nos, especially Admiral McRaven's comments about the need to remove the president from office. So I'm just going to toss that hand grenade out there and let you guys duck and cover or shoot back as whatever you seems best. Nora, why don't you start us off?
Well, I think we'll start with Jim.
Oh, right. They cooked this up, and then they sat in different spots. So they made it hard for me.
We had to follow our name.
Nora's actually running the show. Jim, why don't you go ahead and start?
Sure, thanks so much. I want to thank Rebecca as well for putting this together and for inviting us. It's been fantastic. I really enjoyed the first discussion. I'll also give a blanket disclaimer for both Heidi and myself. Although we're active duty Army officers, neither one of us are speaking on behalf of the Army, and no one should confuse any of our opinions or anything we say today with positions of the U.S. Army, Department of Defense, or in my case, U.S. mission to NATO. So to start off with that, rather than focusing on the generals themselves or retired generals themselves and what they say, I want to look at the last 40 years of civil-military relations, some of the broad trends, because I don't think we can understand what's happening without first looking at the trends that we've been seeing. And I'm going to focus on three particular trends: political polarization along partisan lines, elevated confidence in the military, and media fragmentation. So we've seen polarization, political polarization before, both at the start of the Cold War, at the height of Vietnam War. But what is really unique today is that we are seeing partisan polarization, where it is not just involving the military in disputes about a particular issue or about a particular argument. It is actually bringing the military into the middle of partisan fights, and it is putting us in between Republicans and Democrats in the broader narrative of domestic politics. And I think that's very different than what we've seen, at least throughout the 1900s. Another thing that does is it makes it much clearer when we have polarization where Democrats stand, where Republicans stand, and then where the military, or at least senior military leaders, stand in relation to them. It's very hard not to be in a position where you feel like you're picking a side, even if your position is not motivated by a partisan reason. You can very quickly get cast on either side. At the same time, there is pressure to pick sides both directly and indirectly, and since the 1970s, we've actually seen the nonpartisan norm among officers completely break down. In the mid-1970s, a minority of Army officers identified with the political party, about 40 to 45%. Now, depending on the poll, it's anywhere between 80 and 90% of officers, roughly the same as other elites in American society. So that norm, although we talk about it some, and although it is still there in practice in a lot of ways, at least when it comes to identification, it is no longer in practice. The last thing it does is it raises the political stakes. When there is no room for compromise, when politics is zero-sum, it matters a lot more who controls institutions, and it matters who controls DOD and the military institution itself. And so it raises the stakes of having the military on your side. At the same time, as Carlin pointed out in the last panel, we've also seen confidence in the military raise pretty steadily since the 1970s, especially relative to other government institutions. That makes the perceived benefit of having the military on your side even more important. Peter Fever and I actually are doing a pretty large book project on this now. We ran a first large wave of surveys with the University of Chicago this last summer with about 5,000 respondents, about 1,000 veterans. And so we'll have more to say on this. But some of our preliminary results point to some of the things Carlin said and a few different things. So first, what we see is that performance really does matter. Americans think that the military works and that other civilian institutions, at least at the federal level, don't. Some of this goes back to Goldwater-Nichols. We are clearly much more operationally effective, even if you can make a case that we have not been as strategically effective or that our advice has not improved as much as you might hope. Second, party does matter. There is a partisan gap between Republicans and Democrats, with Republicans starting to see the military as, or at least military support, as part of their identity. But both Democrats and Republicans are more likely to like or have confidence in the military when they see the military doing something that they think shares their partisan slant. And the only time that we found that individuals, partisans, get upset about partisan activity by the military is when it is on the other side of the aisle. Third, we also see the military getting positive press at national sporting events, in movies, other things. I won't dwell on that. And then finally, we see sort of a pressure and patriotism. So one thing we don't talk about, we act like it was a steady increase in confidence since the end of the Vietnam War. Actually, after 9/11, it increased it by about 12 points in 1 year. And it's stayed that level, plus or minus a few, ever since. So there is an elevation. And another thing we found is that when you ask people questions that try to get at their underlying attitudes, we actually find that perhaps as many as 15% or more say they support the military, but they're not so sure they do, but they feel pressure to say that because it's socially acceptable to do so. All that comes together, though, to put pressure on people to vie for military support. And that creates some really perverse incentives, especially because with a smaller military and a polarized and fragmented military environment, it allows people in the media in particular to create a caricature of what the military is. And so, a lot of times we think, oh, well, McRaven's op-ed, it's really going to matter because people are going to see. But if you watch Fox News or you go to the Fox website, you don't either hear it or you hear a large number of other views on the other side of the issue drowning it out. And so we forget that people are simply not sharing the same narratives or having the same experience about what the military is doing. And as a result, you have both Democrats and Republicans having a claim to say that the military is on our side right now. And they can both point to facts or anecdotes or polling data that can plausibly make that case. And depending on which news source, blog post you're reading, you get a very different view. And I think that media environment matters quite a bit. The other thing that matters about that media environment, and we've seen this with President Trump, with Fox News, we've also seen it some with Democrats, where people will try to peel off veterans who say things they don't like as not real patriots or not real veterans, because they're saying something that doesn't match the narrative of what I think a veteran is, and therefore just peel them off and say they're not really military, and it allows you to sort of keep this narrative of what the military is. Now, it's unclear how long you can keep that up, but at least for now, we're still seeing these diverging views of different views. Okay, all three of these trends have combined together over the last 40 years to do a couple things that are really harmful, I think, to civil-military relations. First is it causes civilians to see the military as a constituency to fight over. That gives perverse incentives to the military. It can bring entitlement. It can make us feel like we have political clout in issues that maybe we shouldn't. Second, it creates the incentives for political leaders to try to get the military to appear to be on their side, either in reality or in perception. Third, in some cases, especially over the last couple of years, we've actually seen people encourage military leaders to break norms we hadn't seen before. So you see people saying, hey, it's okay that you resist President Trump because we really don't like him. Or, hey, it's okay if you speak out in favor of President Trump because we really do like him and we need to tamp down these critics. And so we actually see people not encouraging the military to do things that we've never wanted the military to do. Okay, the last point very much related to that is you see people on the same side of the aisle looking the other way when their party does it. And they say, hey, if I see someone encouraging or I see another civilian in my party saying this, I'm not going to bring it up because although it's uncomfortable, at least it helps me. And we have public polling data that shows that people like it more when the military is on our side. Now, make no mistake, these problems have increased over the last 3 years, and it's accelerated to some degree, but they didn't start in the last 3 years. And they're not going to be immediately or automatically fixed at the next election, regardless of who wins. We can look at this and we can say, when it comes to civil-military relations, in a lot of ways, we're very resilient. There's no risk of a military coup, where the military usurps political power, and we're probably in good shape in a lot of ways. But my concern is not coups, but rather coalitions. So what we see today is civilian leaders from one or both parties courting military leaders, right now retired officers, but it's not that much of a stretch to imagine them also starting to court active duty officers or certain elements of active duty as part of a coalition to use against their political opponents. And in many ways, it's becoming normalized in ways that are going to be really hard for us to ever turn around. Norms are really hard to establish, but they're very easy to lose. And I think we're running a risk of being in a position where we think, or some people think, we really got to do this now for political reasons, and we just might not be able to get things back in the box. At their core, civil-military relations in a divided republic like the United States are not fundamentally about a contest between the military and civilians. They are fundamentally about a contest between civilian groups competing for political power and how the military fits into that competition. Okay, and that's a different view than we usually think of. We like to think of the civil-military gap with the military on one side, civilians on the other. But that's not how this really breaks down. I've been a critic of Huntington, but I want to wrap things up with a quote that he said. And one thing he did that we don't pay much attention to is he makes some warnings on the civilian side. And Huntington wrote, "Political leaders often are unwilling simply to accept a politically neutral officer corps. They continue to insist upon the subordination of the officer corps to their own interests and principles. Consequently, a high level of civilian control has been a rare phenomenon even among Western societies." So for me, the most important question in American civil-military relations today is not President Trump's tweets or Admiral McRaven's op-eds, but it's whether political elites, both civilians and military, can roll back these trends in our society, and whether we can decide to treat civilian control of the military and the military itself not as an alliance to be cultivated or a prize to be won, but rather to treat it as that rare phenomenon which we need to defend and protect.
Well, there's a Huntington quote for everything, isn't there? Nora, is Heidi next or are you next? I think Heidi's supposed to be next.
That's okay. Yeah, well, Jim certainly hit on the theme of the nonpartisan ethic, and I'd like to talk a little bit more about that now. And this question that I keep wrestling with is, when this era of polarization has subsided, and I have no idea when that will be, but when it has subsided, how will the uniformed military have fared? And what will be the state of the nonpartisan ethic? And it's probably worth examining what is the state of it today, amidst these extraordinarily high levels of trust and confidence that the previous panel spoke about. And I'm glad Seth brought up this idea of the public holding the military with both ignorance and reverence at the same time. And I think where we see that ignorance is also in the public's understanding or lack thereof of the norm of the nonpartisan ethic. So we're in this unique position where it falls on the military to self-police and self-regulate. And that's one of the ways we can assess the health of the norm. But I'd warn at the start, there's a false positive we need to be aware of. And almost every election season, we tend to have one well-publicized misstep by a member of the uniformed military. I think we've already had one where a member of the South Carolina Army National Guard appeared in uniform at a rally for former Vice President Joe Biden and publicly endorsed him. When these happen, they're usually followed by a swift condemnation, some sort of internal investigation within the military. And while these events tend to be infrequent, the fact that those violations are policed or enforced is not necessarily an indicator of the health of the norm. Because what I would argue, in the example I just cited, it was a clear violation of a rule, not just a norm. It's a violation of policy, and that's the Department of Defense Directive 1344.10, which prohibits uniformed military from engaging in partisan political activities and requires all military personnel to avoid even the inference that their political activities imply some sort of DoD endorsement of a candidate or a cause. So enforcement of rules, especially when a rule violation is clear and public, doesn't truly speak to the health of the norm. And I would offer that while rules can be violated, when norms break, they tend to erode. And they erode slowly over time, and that erosion may be less visible. So let me offer 3 areas to watch that left untended to during this highly charged era of polarization may do real harm to the armed forces' credibility as a nonpartisan institution. And picking up on the last panel, Jim and I have written about the danger of a politically active and vocal cohort of retired general and flag officers. And whether it's through endorsements of presidential candidates, letters signed by 40 retired generals and admirals urging the president to, quote, start living up to the values of the U.S. Armed Forces, or through the frenzied chant of lock her up at the last presidential nominating convention, increased partisan activity by retired general officers and flag officers signals to the American public that at the end of the day, members of the military are partisans just like everybody else. The idea that the public can separate and differentiate between retired generals and active duty, to me, is absurd. And I think of what Dick Cohn's memorable line is, especially for retired 4-stars, like princes of the church, they never really retire. And if we again go back and we assume that today the public holds the military with extraordinary respect, but a good degree of ignorance, then I think it further underscores that idea that they're probably not drawing a fair distinction between retired and active duty. The second thing I think we should be on the lookout for, it's not just those on the retired rolls who are contributing to the erosion of the norm. Some survey research I conducted back in 2015 of active duty officers found some surprising evidence about the behavior of active duty military on social media. And I'll share a few stats. 35% of those surveyed indicated their active duty friends made or shared inappropriate social media posts about specific elected leaders. 50% indicated their active duty friends disparaged politicians running for office. And about 34% reported observing the same behavior by their active duty friends directed against the president. And this was before the 2016 election, so I would be eager to see where that data looks like today. But among other things, these findings show that for some members of the military, they have a very skewed vision of what constitutes public and private discourse. And again, as the previous example of retired general and flag officers, active duty military members who violate the norm of nonpartisanship on social media, which provides a written lasting record, it's not a private conversation, it signals to the public that it's normal for the politics of those in uniform to be widely understood and known. And second, that it's fine for members of the military to express their political views just like any other citizen. Third, the health of the norm can also be measured somewhat by how well it is taught and reinforced. Norms are not imbued without constant teaching and reinforcement. And I think back of some of our previous chairmen of the Joint Chiefs, Admiral Mike Mullen and General Marty Dempsey were very vocal in their defense of the norm of the nonpartisan ethic, and even that it should extend into retirement. General Joe Dunford was a little bit more understated in his defense of the norm, and we don't yet know how General Mark Milley will kind of navigate these politically charged waters. But if the only teaching and reinforcement of the norm happens once every 4 years during an election cycle when the chairman writes their obligatory op-ed in Joint Force Quarterly to keep their politics private, I think we have a little bit more to do on teaching and reinforcing the norm. We can also look at professional military education that I think we have lost that as a matter of instruction and reinforcement. So if the norm is not being taught, the norm is not being reinforced on a daily basis, you have retired general officers and flag officers at least give the perception they're speaking for active duty, and then you have your own slippery slope for those on active duty who are wading into political waters, even if it's on social media. It questions the durability of the norm. So I think under normal political circumstances, perhaps the ethic would be okay, and it could weather this slippage. But in this era where things are so politically charged, I worry about what each of these three things, an active vocal cohort of retired general and flag officers, active duty military members who are probably swayed, as Jim said, by the environment today and show an increased willingness to express themselves and show less restraint. And then lastly, a reticence to reinforce it and teach it among our most senior general and flag officers questions to me the durability of the norm and how it will survive maybe 10 years from now.
It's got to be you, Nora. You're the best one available.
It is. It is finally me. I also want to thank Rebecca for the invitation to be here, and it's really a pleasure to share this panel with all three of you, but the two of you have done such great work on civil military relations throughout your careers. It's really a privilege to be sitting up here and to hear your thoughts on this. I want to almost go back to the prior question of this panel. And I think part of what the entire session is about is why is this norm of nonpartisanship so important? Those of us who live and breathe military issues often, I think, don't go far enough in talking about why it's so important to defend this norm and why, you know, many of us come to the conclusion that this is something that is dangerously, dangerously eroding. And that's because it is absolutely essential to effective warfighting. And it is absolutely essential that the president, whoever occupies the Oval Office, gets the best, most nonpartisan, you know, least clouded advice from the senior military leaders as possible. You don't want to have a situation where the president is only listening to some generals or some admirals over others because they are aligned with the same party, because there is a sense that that party supports what is going on, and therefore the advice of a different military officer, for example, in the position of being the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who is supposed to be the principal military advisor to the president, that advice is somehow tainted by a partisan lens. And I don't think that, you know, those of us who study this and are involved in this don't often go far enough in saying why this norm is so critically important to the future viability of the military, to our warfighting ability, and to ultimately to the proper role of a military in society. And so I want to start there because I think that that's the most important context for this entire conversation that we're having. I don't think there's any issue whatsoever with what the previous panel was talking about with any retired military personnel of any level choosing to run for office, because then that is clearly a situation where someone is entering a partisan domain and the voters get to choose based on their background, taking into account their military service and so on. So, you know, veterans running for office, I think, is completely separate from this question of the right role of retired and active duty military personnel weighing in on partisan politics rather than choosing to stand for office themselves. This issue of campaign endorsements tends to get the most attention because it's the most obvious, and we're obviously heading into an election cycle this year, and so we're going to be seeing it again, even though for all the reasons that both Jim and Heidi have outlined, you know, this is deeply, deeply problematic especially when you have the most senior officers, those retired generals and admirals, taking partisan positions, because I think Heidi, you said it exactly right, that it is absurd to think that there's some magical distinction in the minds of the American public, and particularly in the current and potential occupants of the Oval Office. I'm not talking about Trump per se, but, you know, presidents that, you know, can't distinguish between that, don't see that as something that they will be concerned about, and don't, when they're talking to their chairman of the Joint Chiefs, when they're serving as president, think, what is this person going to say about me when they leave office? Which party are they going to support when they leave office? So it's incredibly damaging to have these very high-level endorsements. Having said all that, we're going to see it again. Right? It is because of the environment that we're in, it is going to be happening at the 2020 conventions. I can't tell you exactly which individuals will be doing it, but I guarantee they will be. And I think that's, you know, the longer that goes on and the more intense it is, the more deeply, deeply problematic it becomes. You both rightly noted, and Jim, you said this explicitly, that this trend of politicizing particularly the senior leaders, has a long history. It goes back to really the late 80s and early 90s, and it has been growing throughout that time. But I also think that we have to acknowledge that this has grown significantly under President Trump. Now, I'm talking about him as an individual rather than the generic president, you know, in a civil-military dynamic. You know, this is someone who, when he came into office, not only chose to appoint a lot of retired generals to positions that were traditionally partisan, such as the White House Chief of Staff, you know, which is explicitly designed to promote the agenda of the president, but he also referred to all of them as my generals, sort of exacerbating that. I have a lot of questions going forward about what it means that all three of these senior generals who were referred to as my generals in the first 2 years have now been ousted or held in disregard by the White House, talked about as such, and what that does to erode the credibility of the retired officer corps in terms of giving advice and, again, filtering down to active duty folks. So that has happened. He's also used the military. There was a discussion in the previous panel about using the military as a prop. He has deliberately turned a lot of events with members of the military, which had been nonpartisan events when presidents have spoken in the past, with their language, the president's language being very carefully chosen to be nonpartisan in those situations. He talks at those in exactly the same way he talks at campaign rallies, and has used phone calls to the troops to endorse his agenda as well. So we're seeing a lot of norm shattering going on the civilian side of the civilian-military divide as well. The event that I think was most concerning about the erosion of this norm and what it means, which neither of you mentioned yet, was what happened, the incident with the USS John McCain earlier this year, when a request went from a White House office to someone serving on the USS John McCain, a ship that was in port where President Trump was going to speak, and asked them to somehow cover up the name of the ship, because John McCain has been one of the president's most traditional, before he passed away, was one of his most virulent critics, and no love lost between those two individuals. To me, there are problems on both sides. It was a huge problem that the White House, even though Trump said he had no knowledge that this was being done, which I believe, but that a White House official at all thought this was an appropriate request to make. And then I found it even worse that most of the people on the ship seemed to comply with it. That tarp was put up, and it took, fortunately, it went very quickly up the chain of command, and a Navy 3-star was the one who ultimately killed it and said, take the tarp off. That was an inappropriate request, and it was inappropriate to actually agree to it. The fact that it took a 3-star general, it had to go up to that level for someone to push back and say, this is not an appropriate request and it should not be honored, I thought was the worst takeaway from that story. And it struck me that all of the people in the chain of command up to and including the captain of the ship should have at least gone way out of their way to question this. I understand the junior officer who took the phone call may not feel that he or she is in the position to say no to the White House, but should have at least run it up their own chain of command to say, I got this request, what should I do with it? Even up to the captain of the ship, if it was uncomfortable, should have taken that up through their chain of command if they were not sure what to do, rather than agreeing to it immediately. So I find that deeply problematic as an example of the erosion of understanding of what that proper relationship and balance should be. There are a lot of other dimensions to the civil-military dynamic other than the politicization and the partisanship that we're talking about, that we could talk about the overall health of civil-military relations. But I want to mention one which is a little bit different, but I do think ultimately ties into this issue of civilian control over the military, which is obviously such a strong, it's one of the core principles of our form of government, really of any democracy, if you think about it. One of the things that I see emerging as a narrative among many people who have served in the recent wars at all levels, not just the more junior people, it's still a minority view. I want to emphasize that. I don't think that every member of the military holds this, but I think it is so problematic that even though it's a minority view, it is worth noting. And that is the idea that if you haven't served in the military, you don't know what you're talking about, you shouldn't be weighing in on military affairs. And I see that attitude growing among the military officers that I talk to at all ranks. Frankly, it was exacerbated by Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis, who, before he was appointed as the Secretary of Defense, essentially wrote that in a book that he published in 2015, that what the role of the civilians is to set the broadest policy direction and then entirely get out of the way and let the military make its decisions on its own. I think that view came out of a sense of frustration with the Obama White House in particular. I think there was a sense among many military officers that they thought the Obama administration was micromanaging into military affairs. and not providing enough clarity about goals, while also providing too much micromanagement as to how military operations should be conducted. Whether that's a fair criticism or not is something that can be debated. But I do think this idea that, as I said, is growing, that if you didn't serve in the military, you basically don't have the credibility to talk about military affairs, is a really fundamental threat to how we constitute civilian control over the military in this country, and one that has also been exacerbated by the tremendous number of political vacancies in the Department of Defense. There are political vacancies throughout the government, but it's problematic in this reason in the Department of Defense. And frankly, that so many of the political appointees in the Department of Defense in this administration have been retired military personnel. Normally, I wouldn't flag that as a source of concern. I think that having them serve in those positions is appropriate. But the fact that so many of them are, while there are so few confirmed civilians in those positions, reinforces this narrative that I mentioned, that only the people who are qualified to serve in senior defense positions are those people who have served in the military themselves. I think that's a very dangerous dynamic. Again, a minority view, but increasing and going clearly in the wrong direction.
Well, I think we have pretty broad agreement that we've got problems. And what I'd like to do in the next 15 minutes or so is try to pick those things apart a little bit with a little bit of discipline. I very much like this sort of structure that we set up of sort of the combination of ignorance about military affairs and reverence for people who serve. So as we go around, I think maybe the first way to try to use that framework is to talk a little bit more about civilian attitudes. Then maybe in a second round, we'll talk about how that's affecting the officer class. I'm especially struck by and quite agree with the idea that the ethos has not been as well inculcated as it might have been. But I want to conclude, I think, and just to give you guys a heads up, with maybe a discussion about whether this calls into question our fundamental framework for analyzing civil-military relations, particularly the Huntington objective control model, which is, I think this is a quote I'm stealing from Peter Fever, that everything since Huntington is just a commentary on or a footnote to his work. Because it is true, we have yet to sort of get out of that paradigm, and if that paradigm has led us to where we are now, maybe there's something wrong with the design in the first place. So let's begin with the civilian equation. One of the things the first panel might have discussed, and maybe those who are still here can chip in, is these candidates were not entirely self-selecting. They were intentionally recruited and very with intent by both parties, particularly the Democrats going back maybe 2 cycles ago, but Republicans in response to the success that the Democrats had. So what do we make of the fact that the parties, committees, and structures seem to want to recruit veterans and to associate themselves with that sort of higher plane of moral reverence and the competence that comprises the myth of the modern American service person? We can just, so I can keep track of things, maybe we'll just go down the row. So Nora, unless you want to intervene and take the reins again.
No.
So why don't you start us off?
Sure, I think that's a great question, and I was thinking about that too with the earlier panel. It is not a coincidence that there are so many recent veterans in Congress because, as Giselle said, they were very deliberately recruited. And in particular, female veterans were very specifically recruited by the Democrats. And I think that, it's understandable to me, analytically, this is not a partisan comment, that if you were the Democrats looking at the 2018 midterms, that is the demographic you would want, because there's so much grassroots support for putting women forward after the 2016 election, and a sense that they would make very viable candidates. picking on women who have backgrounds in the military, sort of, first of all, they can position themselves as more nonpartisan. We talked about before whether that's actually translating into legislative action, which it may not be, particularly because the identity of the the identity of the military, the military is, I forget who mentioned the statistics, is more dominantly Republican, so it's more newsworthy if they run as Democrats. It seems more of a conscious choice and a statement to be made. But also it burnishes their national security credentials in ways that female candidates have not always had, which was also an appealing message and builds on the mystique of the honor of serving in the military. Again, I don't really have a problem with that because it is very clearly in the realm of electoral politics. In terms of this norm, I don't think it undermines or violates the norm of nonpartisanship that the military has.
Let me push a little bit on that. Do you think it reinforces this idea of people in uniform as an interest group or even an identity group in the sort of context of particularly the way the Democratic Party approaches politics?
I personally don't.
Okay.
I think people can disagree with that. I personally don't because you are making a conscious decision to put yourself in an electoral contest and ultimately the people get to decide that. Right? Part of the problem with the politicization is that nobody's electing these retired generals to, comment on, to make partisan comments, to comment on policies and so on. Ultimately the voters get to make the decision if that particular veteran is qualified and if their military service is relevant to their campaign, the same way they would evaluate the background of any other citizen. So to me, from the partisanship perspective, I don't find that problematic.
Yeah, so I'm going to start off with the ignorance point, because I think that is one of the things that we need to focus on as we think about this question. It is not just what is legally right, as Heidi pointed out, it's also how does the public perceive this? And one of the things that was really striking to me in the work I've been doing with Peter Fever, we took a list of 10 active and retired generals, and we tried to pick names that were big names: Powell, Petraeus, Milley, Dunford, McMaster, Mattis. And what's striking, we did this in June 2019. What was striking was that Mattis, for example, when we asked people, is he active or retired, the overwhelming majority simply didn't know. The largest group was don't know. About 30% could identify him as retired. About 25% could identify him as retired. About 15% thought he was active. About 35% thought that didn't know, and then the rest said they'd never heard of him. So this idea that we have that everybody's paying attention and everybody knows the difference between Admiral so-and-so and retired Admiral so-and-so probably just doesn't hold up with the public. And so I think we need to think a lot more carefully about that. I do think that parties try to tap into that in all sorts of different ways. I think they probably do that to some degree in elections. I'm still thinking through this. I had very clearly been in the same place that Nora has been, and I think that's probably still where I'd land. But I do think there are some concerns about the interest group activity. I think what mediates it in this case is that once you are elected, then you very clearly become a partisan figure. We don't think of John McCain usually as Captain John McCain. We think of him as Senator John McCain. And so there's a process through which you transition from being a military figure to being a political figure.
But he was also, from a different pre-AVF era. So does the fact of having a professional force change that dynamic in some way, or at some rank level or something like that?
Yeah, I think I'm less concerned about the professional force and all volunteer force and more about the size. And I think that's a big driver here. People just don't have as many contacts with the military as they used to. And so it changes the context, it changes the way they experience this. Interestingly, one of the things we talk about with ignorance, the polling data we have actually shows that the closer you are to the military, the more confidence you have in it. So it's not obviously clear that ignorance breeds confidence in the military, although people who are ignorant of the military are more confident than they would have been 20 years ago.
And actually, one of the curious things is how widespread the sort of PTSD trope is. So there was a YouGov survey a 3 years ago that basically, and it was, across age groups and across partisan affiliation, that sort of said 80% of veterans have had a, sort of debilitating experience while in uniform. It's interesting data. Sorry, Heidi.
No, Jim and I have a chapter we're working on for a book where we've talked about some of this and the idea of how the military tends to be represented in popular media today. And it's somewhat of a function of, I think, of the public's overall view. And it tends to be this caricature. You can think about it. They're either completely damaged by war with post-traumatic stress, or they're part of a SEAL team, kicking in a door.
Or they're both.
And sometimes they're both, right? And so
American
they
sniper.
tend to go off of these caricatures right now.
Can I just say, Rosa Brooks wrote a wonderful piece called Heroes, Victims, and Villains, which are the 3 stereotypes that most Americans have about veterans.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think from the perspective of the uniformed military, what I worry about with these incredibly high confidence levels are when the military starts to believe its own press, right? And I think there's a generation that only knows today, of those serving, that only knows the adoring support of the American public and thinks that can't be lost and thinks it can't be broken. And it's probably, when we don't teach the norm as well as we can, there's not a lot of reflection on how could we lose that support.
Well, again, the thing that struck me about McRaven's op-ed, as much as the sort of call to remove the president, was that he said it in this context of a retirement ceremony at Fort Bragg for, and there was a lot of bloody shirt waving, and also for a commemorative dinner for people who served in the OSS during World War II. So before he gets to, out of the norm conclusion, to put it mildly, he reiterates this sort of, I think psychologically, he's elevating himself to a higher moral plane, which is sort of giving him, I hate to over psychoanalyze this, but he's sort of claiming permission to do something that's would be way outside the ethos by traditional definitions.
I think that is my problem with that op-ed and the Newsweek op-ed that came out shortly after that in response to Syria, is that it's not just that he's using his First Amendment rights, he is using his First Amendment rights to intentionally blur his distinction between being a private citizen and military. He talks about a retirement ceremony. The Newsweek op-ed talks about the president living up to military values. So it's not just him coming out and saying, hey, I didn't serve for this president. I've been watching the news just like all of you, but I have some other experience, and here's my opinion. It's him saying, hey, I'm part of the military, and this is what the military thinks. And that's what's damaging. It's not him bringing his perspective. It's him insinuating that he is bringing the military perspective.
Even if he doesn't say or imply I speak for the force, the reason why this is so much of a bigger deal when we're talking about retired generals and flag officers, you don't tend to get into conflagrations about retired colonels or retired lieutenant colonels who do this. The reason why it's so problematic among the flag and general officers is their first name will always be general or admiral. This was not Bill McRaven. Nobody thinks of him as Bill McRaven. If Bill McRaven had written this op-ed based on some military experience, we'd be having a different conversation. It's because McRaven's first name is not Bill, but Admiral to everybody but his family. Right? And so that makes a huge difference. That's why it's different for general officers and flag officers, because there is no ability in the public's eye, or really even in the military eye, to separate their individual views. That's why you'll often hear the pushback, well, I have First Amendment rights like everyone else. That is true. That is a legal statement. That's why this norm is so important on why you don't do that, even though you have the legal right to do it.
So let me try to get us to a point where we can do what I want to do, but also get to audience questions and ask not simply are we failing to teach to standard, so to speak, but do we have the right standard? Again, the idea of the military as a class or a calling or a profession that stands apart from the citizenry as a whole. Is there something, and that is able to offer such important technical advice that it should always be, weighed heavily? Is there a problem with that standard? Or are we just not doing it well? Let's come back this way, just to be different.
Well, I think Nora articulated the criticality of it and why it is so important. And to shy away from that somewhat unconsciously, right? So, I mean, there are the egregious violations that are well recounted and handled on the spot, but it's this erosion that I'm most concerned about because it appears more unconscious. It's the less of an inclination to self-regulate and self-police, and over time, you're left with the perception that, well, maybe they're just a bunch of partisans like everybody else, and I think that would be hugely damaging to the credibility of the armed forces. And it's, again, when you reflect on what could chip away at those 70+% trust and confidence numbers, I have to think that being viewed as just another interest group would certainly do it.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'll take it one step farther, though, and I do think there's a problem not only with the way we teach it, but the way we conceptualize it. So it is not good enough just to say, these are the things you can't do. You can't be partisan, you can't participate in elections, and then leave it at that. Because we get this conflation, we talk about apolitical, but what does that really mean? For me, all military officers are political. We operate in a political environment, in a political context. Everything we see, particularly in a polarized environment, is going to be interpreted in that way. And so if we don't teach officers how to engage in that discussion, and we just say, don't be political, you can't talk in public, then we're doing a huge disservice. We're not allowing them to actually engage in substantive debates in ways that are helpful, either in private or in public, because they feel like they have to step back. And we do. I mean, one of the reasons we have military leaders who are appointed to advise the president is because we think their advice is valuable. We think that their experience and their knowledge is something that needs to be brought into the national security space. And so when we cut this off and say there's no role, that's not good enough either. So we need to reconcile this political versus partisan and start thinking harder about what are the positive norms. How do we teach people not just about where they can't engage, but when they can and how they should.
Learn how to be Clausewitzian and Huntingtonian at the same time.
No, I think, Jim, you formulated it perfectly. And I think that's an expectation that needs to be reinforced from all levels. I agree with you, it needs to be taught in the academies, in ROTC programs, all the way up through the various pieces of professional military education. But it also needs to be a top-down message that is consistently referred to and mentioned by the most senior military leaders, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the individual service chiefs. I co-author a column with my colleague, retired Lieutenant General Dave Barno, for War on the Rocks. And we wrote a column a couple of years ago now, I think, that talked about the importance of that top-down message. And we actually drafted a letter that was our wish list, a letter that every chairman or service chief would give to a newly minted one-star general or admiral in particular. Again, it needs to be at all levels, but there's special consideration when you put stars on your shoulders for the first time that would reinforce that norm, that would set the expectation from these most senior 4-stars about what is appropriate as well as what's not appropriate and how to walk that balance. I think that, that was our idea of how to try to make it better, but it has to come from the top down to the entire force as well as being taught from the bottom up to reinforce it.
Okay, we've got 10 minutes or so left for cross-examination. Who'd like to go first? Yeah. It's coming.
So I guess I'm a bit more glass half full about this. I obviously agree with all the norms we're talking about on a theoretical basis. But I also think it's pretty striking that as the rest of the country and the rest of our institutions have become so much more polarized, the military has maintained, quite a bit of not just the perception, but the reality of a nonpartisan atmosphere. Especially compared to other institutions, and also considering that it's certainly not even though, despite the idea of civilian control, it's not the civilian leaders who are the ones pushing for the military to be, at least the commander-in-chiefs, aren't the ones pushing for for the military to be nonpartisan. And so I'm just wondering, I may be wrong about this, but can you provide just evidence of increased partisanship, or what are the actual effects that we're talking about? That it seems, just from the conversation here, that we're maybe not in a crisis, but getting close to one. I agree there are probably some negative things that have happened recently, but can you just, overall, just can you just give some evidence of the change over time? What the sort of the negative effects are? Is there increased partisanship by generals? I'm thinking about, from Colin Powell back to Admiral Crowe endorsing Clinton. Before that, go back to MacArthur with Truman, the Congress bringing him to speak, and McClellan and Lincoln. It seems like there's been, over time, this has happened. And what is sort of different now, and what are the negative effects that are being caused by that?
Maybe just one observation of what's different from maybe the first Admiral Crowe endorsement is now you have this arms race to get hundreds of flag officers attest to some political endorsement. And as Jim has said, the really unfortunate thing is it doesn't seem to have an impact whatsoever on voters' decision making. And so when you think about, is it worth it as a retired flag officer to sell your stars for something like that, that doesn't have a consequence at the poll? I think that is different from maybe where we were in 1988. And I will also say that it's on both aisles, right? There is a race to try
an arms race
yes, to try to get
sign
as
up
many
generals you never heard of before.
Right.
That's right.
What's the negative cause? What's caused? I think that is sort of the I'm looking at that as sort of what's causing the problem, I guess. That is, in and of itself, you can say it's a problem, but if we're talking about this being a crisis, I think you're talking more about that's going to cause a decrease in, whether it's a problem for civil-military relations or is that the problem in and of itself, or is there a problem being caused by that?
So I think there's two things. There's the idea among our parties today that is a constituency that you need to have as part of your endorsement. And so that shows that, again, we need to court the interest group that's known as the military, and I think that's problematic. Number two, when you have these in such large numbers, as opposed to maybe 30 years ago when you'd have a single endorsement here or there, it does tend to create the perception that all military are partisan at the end of the day, and you can figure out their politics, where I think in the past, it's always one of those things you never really know how members of the military or senior general and admirals would have voted. And in many cases, the idea of general marshals, complete abstaining from voting seems to be this quaint, aspect of nostalgia compared to kind of how we accord ourselves today.
Jim, I was going to say, there has been long-running poll data suggesting that the force overall skews conservative or Republican. I don't know whether that's reversed in the Trump years.
Yeah, Heidi probably is actually better positioned to answer that. I haven't done any polling on the force since the Trump election. The one thing I will say is her dissertation, there was a claim that the same thing happened during the Iraq War with President Bush, and it didn't. So there's an idea that members of the senior officer corps are judging the president and picking their party based on that, when in fact, most of the time, at least from what I can tell, members of the senior officer corps are partisans who interpret the political world just like other partisans.
No.
I would take much less solace in the numbers on the confidence in the military than I think you do. The problem, I agree with you, it's at historic highs. The trend over the past 15 years, 20 years really, is nothing short of remarkable. Here's the problem. This paradox Rosa Brooks also wrote on this, this paradox of ignorance and awe that the American people have. The fact that the American people are so ignorant of the US military means that that has the potential to become a very fragile number indeed. It has been extraordinarily resilient, but the fact that the American people know nothing about the military, overestimate it to be 6 times as large as it actually is. All sorts of, the litany of statistics you could use to prove this point is astounding. Means that small things have the potential to chip away and erode it. It's one of the things that I think we, may see from the fallout of Trump calling the first wave of generals my generals, now having them seen as sort of publicly discredited. That has the potential to impact how people see generals and admirals and the military overall, to take just one narrow example. So I think that number, although it is strong and it has been resilient, we cannot assume that that is going to continue to be the case, because the American people don't know anything about the military. It's not based on any concrete knowledge whatsoever.
Can I jump in? Because I've got some really concrete points for you. So the first I pointed out, among the officer corps in particular, much more partisan, 1970s 40 to 45%, now 85 to 90%. That's the first. Second, the public is picking up on this. So compared to other institutions, the public still thinks of the military as less partisan than other institutions. Only about half, from what we can tell, identify the military as a majority of the members being overtly partisan. But out of that half, it's about 80% think the military is Republican, 20% think that 10% think the military leans left, and 10% think that there's an equal mix. So there's a clear perception that it is growing, and we've at least got a couple polls now that show that that's increasing. Third, on my generals, so my dissertation was about the appointment of 4-star generals. One thing we've seen is over time, presidents and members of Congress are trying to find generals who share their worldviews. They're not explicitly asking partisan questions, but they find, if you're President Clinton, you say, well, I don't think Colin Powell necessarily shares my views on the use of force. Who can I find that does? Yeah. And overnight, your best military advice, or the military advice that someone gives before Congress, changes from 5 years, $5 billion and 300,000 troops to go to Bosnia, to we can do it in a year with 27,000 troops and it'll be relatively inexpensive. So that's a big difference when you see that, and we see that growing over time. If you look at the Supreme Court as an example, do we see the military appointment system moving that way? There's some evidence that we're not there yet, but that we might be moving that way. In terms of the way the public views this, there's now at least 3 or 4 surveys that show, compared to civilians, people listen to the military much more in terms of not just use of force, but domestic issues. So if you ask them about gun control and you bring up the military, that affects public opinion more than civilian experts. If you ask them about environmental politics, not a clear military expertise, it can shift there more than a civilian expert. And so that seems sort of off and problematic. The last thing I'll point to, I can't give you definite advice, but it's probably the most important in my view, and that goes back to Nora's point about what really matters here is military effectiveness. So if you can look back and say that over the last 20 years, military officers, particularly senior generals, have done a good job in helping political leaders accomplish our strategic objectives, then we are in a different place. I think the U.S. military as an institution has done an extremely bad job of helping political leaders accomplish the goals we want to accomplish. I think we've done a bad job in terms of advice, in terms of providing options, in terms of giving good assessments that allow both decision-making and information that they need. I think it's problematic for all the reasons Heidi pointed out, because oversight has become harder, and it's not clear that political leaders feel empowered to question the military in the ways they do. If not, they get accused of being too micromanaging. And then the last question is, when it comes to accountability, it's not clear that people are able to separate SEAL Team 6 that they see in the movie from the advice that military leaders give. And so as a result, they think we're doing better than we are, at least in terms of accomplishing strategic goals. And so I think all those things are things to be pretty concerned about. It is not a crisis. We are not seeing a crisis where the military is going to take over the republic, but we're moving in the wrong direction. And I don't see that changing without people deciding to change course.
I think the advice is worse than it was 20 years ago. It's been getting, you say there's a salient difference between now, sorry.
You say there's a
there's a salient difference between the strategic advice that military leaders have been giving the civilian leaders for the last 20 years and the strategic advice that the civilian leaders were receiving previously?
So what I'll say is this is a hypothesis, and as I said before, Goldwater-Nichols fixed the joint force. So we don't have desert ones anymore. We actually can operate together across the joint force. We do pretty well operationally and tactically. But instead what it did is it created a chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff who is the principal military advisor to the president, and it cut out most other voices. So it is less likely for the president and members of the White House to hear dissenting military views. It's written into the statute that the chairman has to prevent dissenting military views, but it's not clear that that happens. And so I think my hypothesis is that by hearing less diverse military views, hearing less information, less options, you actually are in a worse place, though I can't necessarily tie that to an empirical study. But I think we're disserved by not bringing in a broader diversity of military voices to give more views than just the one that comes out of the Joint Staff.
And if you had any doubts whatsoever, just go into any talk. It'll be tuned to Fox News. I'm just teasing. Because we have to stop, unfortunately. This was a fabulous panel, and it's been a great day. I'd like to thank Rebecca, who's really been the driving force behind both panels. So, and thanks to the panelists. Here endeth the lesson.